A quiet neighborhood turns into a crime scene. In the crisp early hours of October 15, 2018, the quiet affluence of Westlake, a prestigious neighborhood located in the suburbs of Austin, Texas, was pierced by the sound of wailing sirens. A line of police cruisers, their lights casting red and blue flashes against perfectly manicured lawns and stone facades, tore through the sleepy streets, startling the few joggers who had ventured out for their morning runs. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood accustomed to unrest or chaos. Westlake was known as a tight-knit community, home to top-tier professionals, wealthy retirees, tech entrepreneurs, and a sprinkling of celebrities. The houses were sprawling, set back from private driveways, each architecture seemingly shouting success. Streets were wide, shaded by century-old oak trees lined with picket fences and garden beds that looked straight out of a design magazine. It was a haven where neighbors waved pleasantly but mindfully kept their personal lives private. The most disruptive sounds were usually from landscaping crews trimming hedges or the occasional laughter of children playing in swimming pools. But October 15th would be a day forever stamped as a nightmare in Westlake's history. By 6:45 a.m., the twang of a local news helicopter could be heard overhead, circling the scene as it broadcasted live shots of breaking news across Texas. A column of flashing police lights marked the driveway of the Millers' home, one of the most lavish properties in the neighborhood, sprawling across 2 acres and tucked behind wrought iron gates. Jonathan Miller, the city's revered mayor, was a household name in Austin, a man famed for his charismatic leadership and philanthropic efforts. Inside their grand colonial-style house, his wife, Laura Miller, was found dead in what would soon become one of the city's most shocking criminal investigations. The first responders faced an eerie silence when they pushed through the home's heavy oak front door, its brass handle still cold from the early Texas morning. The lavish interior, with its high cathedral ceilings, marble floors, and sparkling crystal chandeliers, gave no hint of the tragic event that had unfolded within. Cops exchanged uneasy glances as they moved through the mansion's meticulously decorated hallways, past oil paintings and antique heirlooms. This was no ordinary home, and what they were about to walk into was far from an ordinary crime scene. Rumors began rippling through the neighborhood before the police even sealed off the perimeter. Morning commuters, pausing in shock at the cluster of media vans appearing out of nowhere, murmured in hushed whispers. Had someone been robbed? A break-in? A dispute turned violent? But when word trickled out that the mayor's wife, the poised, graceful Laura Miller, often seen hosting charity events or shuttling her children to private school in her sleek black Range Rover, had been found brutally murdered, speculation exploded like wildfire. She was the last person one could imagine falling victim to such a gruesome fate. "This is Westlake," whispered one neighbor, peering through her blinds at the commotion. "Things like this just don't happen here." The neighborhood had long been considered one of the safest corners of Austin, a pocket of prosperity far removed from the city's seedier areas. The Miller estate was nestled in the heart of the neighborhood, guarded by elaborate night lighting and outfitted with top-of-the-line security cameras. But none of that had been enough to stop the horror that took place inside those walls. By 7:15 a.m., word had reached the circles of Austin's elite. Phone lines buzzed endlessly as neighbors called one another, trying to piece together any scraps of information. Coffee shops in the nearby shopping plaza were abuzz with nervous chatter. "Did you hear about the Millers? The police are surrounding their house," one woman whispered to her friend, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she clutched a latte. Some residents felt reassured, albeit momentarily, that this must have been an outsider, perhaps a hired intruder who somehow bypassed the community's impenetrable security. Others weren't so sure. "It's always someone you know," another murmured darkly. As the morning wore on, the gravity of the situation deepened. Laura Miller's murder wasn't just a tragedy for her family, it marked a seismic shift for a neighborhood that had prided itself on its safety and reputation. Neighbors who'd once casually left their doors unlocked now double-checked their locks and set alarms, once unimaginable behavior in this serene piece of suburban paradise. Panic was setting in, subtly, pervasively. The Westlake community, built on luxury and exclusivity, had been cracked open in the ugliest way. For the first time, its residents were reminded that danger was not reserved for neglected corners of the city. Even the tallest gates and most sophisticated alarm systems could not shield them from the fragility of life's unexpected horrors. And so, as forensic teams taped off the Miller home, Carrying out camera equipment and evidence bags, Westlake held its breath. The question lingered in the air as neighbors fretted behind shuttered windows. Was this an isolated act of violence? Or was their affluent, immaculate neighborhood harboring an unimaginable secret? The husband reports the crime in utter despair. It was a little past 8:15 a.m. when Jonathan Miller, mayor of Austin and one of the city's most lauded figures, made the frantic 911 call that would forever stain his remarkable political career. His voice, usually deep and commanding during public speeches, was fractured and trembling as he spoke to the dispatcher. "This is Jonathan Miller," he began, choking on his words. I think my wife is dead. She's not breathing. Oh my God, please, you have to send someone, hurry." His voice cracked in desperation as he gave the address to the dispatcher. In the background, sharp gasps and muffled sobs could be heard, painting the picture of a man devastated and utterly broken. There's so much blood," he stammered, before the dispatcher calmed him enough to keep him on the line, urging him to wait for the arriving officers. The Austin Police Department responded in full force. 15 minutes later, uniformed officers and detectives were standing face-to-face with the high-profile mayor on the grand porch of his colonial-style home. Jonathan was disheveled, bare-faced without his usual polished look. Dressed in an unbuttoned shirt and khakis, his appearance was radically different from the sharp suits and confident demeanor the public was accustomed to seeing on their television screens. His grief-stricken expression and trembling hands betrayed the extent of his turmoil. "I came home," Jonathan exclaimed to the officers, his voice breaking again. "Laura wasn't answering her phone. I thought it was strange, so I left my office early. When I walked in, I saw her. Oh God, I saw her." He threw his hands onto his head and inhaled a shaky breath as an officer placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The man many had regarded as untouchable in city politics, charismatic, eloquent, commanding, now barely seemed strong enough to hold himself upright. "She was just..." He gestured aimlessly to the house behind him, his words escaping as emotion overtook him. "Where exactly did you find her, sir?" one detective asked gently. In our bedroom," Jonathan stammered and gestured weakly toward the staircase within the grand front entryway. "I went upstairs and she was just lying there on the bed. She wasn't moving. I tried to shake her, but there was so much blood." From the porch, the detective glanced up the staircase, a wide mahogany set adorned with ornate railings. It led to a second floor, bathed in soft natural light from an elegant chandelier above, but upstairs, just beyond the grandeur, awaited a crime scene that would turn even the most seasoned detective's stomach. Jonathan's sobbing pulled their attention back. "Who would do this?" he whispered. "Who would hurt her?" His anguish was palpable, his questions echoing in the minds of everyone present. The detectives observed Miller as he continued his account. Sometimes behavior spoke louder than words. While his despair seemed raw and unrestrained, his occasional glances at the officer's notepad, as if checking to ensure his statement was being recorded accurately, were not lost on the detectives. Even the smallest gestures could later become significant details. "Mr. Miller," the lead investigator said, his tone calm but authoritative, "you said you walked into the house at what time?" Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Around 7:45, I think. I had been at the office all morning, left home around 6:30. I called Laura during my drive like I do almost every day, but she didn't pick up." His voice cracked again. "I just thought she was sleeping in or busy. I never imagined this." His hand pressed against his chest as if willing his heart to stay still. "And who else has been inside the house since you found her?" the detective pressed, clearly marking each word carefully in his notepad. "Just me," Jonathan replied earnestly. "I checked every room in the house before calling you. No one else. It's just us this morning. Laura had the day off, and I..." He no longer had the strength to finish his sentence as tears returned, pooling underneath his reddened eyes. The officers shared quick glances between one another, silently analyzing his behavior. Law enforcement was trained to expect a broad spectrum of emotions from grieving family members, but observations were key, especially in cases as high-profile as this. Jonathan Miller, a man whose political campaign was built on trust, charity, and strength, now bore the expression of a man utterly shattered. Forensic teams and investigators moved briskly into the house while Jonathan remained outside, leaning against one of the ornate porch columns. The once pristine image of a powerful, steady leader was replaced by that of a man barely able to take his next step. His hands were visibly shaking and his jaw clenched, as if he was fighting to maintain some semblance of composure. Within 30 minutes, Jonathan was guided into a sleek, unmarked police vehicle parked strategically down the street. He offered no protest as detectives asked him to come down to the station for a more formal interview. "We just have a few follow-up questions, sir," one officer assured as Jonathan nodded, his face ghostly pale. Neighbors who had peeked out cautiously from behind drawn blinds couldn't believe their eyes as they watched the beloved mayor collapse into the back seat of the car, his head dropped low. It was a shocking image in sharp contrast to the measured, assured presence they had once seen on the covers of local magazines and in political campaign ads. Jonathan Miller, the golden boy of Austin politics, was now cast in a far different light. Was this a man reeling from unspeakable grief over the horrific loss of his wife? Or was this the beginning of an unraveling story that would expose the shadowed, darker side of the mayor's perfect life? The clues awaiting just beyond the foyer would soon pit his polished public image against the harsh demands of the truth. An elaborately staged crime scene. When the first responders entered the Miller residence, nothing could have prepared them for the grotesque sight awaiting upstairs. Everything about the exterior of the sprawling colonial-style mansion, with its pristine white columns, immaculate landscaping and a shimmering fountain at the center of the circular driveway, suggested wealth, stability, and safety. But once they crossed the threshold, those illusions gave way to unsettling chaos. Moving methodically through the marble-tiled foyer, the officers noticed that the house had an almost unnatural stillness to it. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the high-dollar diffusers strategically placed in each room, but beneath the soothing scent lingered the metallic tang of blood, an odor recognizable to anyone in law enforcement with more than a week's experience. The living room was untouched. A spotless white sofa faced a gas fireplace, its mantel adorned with family portraits. Voices of children laughing softly emanated from a still-paused home video left running on a large widescreen TV. Everything seemed almost too perfect. But as the team moved further into the residence, up the stately mahogany staircase with its gleaming railings, faintly smeared droplets of blood began to appear on the polished wood floor, a morbid breadcrumb trail leading them straight to the master bedroom. Inside the bedroom, the carefully curated aesthetic of a successful power couple had been transformed into a nightmarish display of violence. Laura Miller lay motionless on the king-sized bed, her gaze frozen in terror. Her arms were tied tightly behind her back with restraint marks visible on her pale skin. Her silk pajama shirt, once perfectly pressed and neat, was crumpled and stained with blood, which had pooled on the bed's white linens. Her bottom half was deliberately unclothed, her vulnerable state an attempt to paint the picture of a sexual assault gone horrifically wrong. The detectives noted the chaos in the room, but it was the kind of chaos that seemed calculated rather than organic. The dresser had its drawers haphazardly pulled out, and expensive jewelry, diamond rings, and high-end watches had been deliberately tossed onto the floor. Cash bills from Laura's designer purse had been scattered across the bedside table as if the perpetrator was hurriedly searching for treasure. To the untrained eye, all of this resembled a robbery gone sideways. But to sharp-eyed detectives, something about it lacked authenticity, as though the scene was trying too hard to tell a specific story. "This looks staged," one officer muttered to his partner as they scanned the room. Most perplexing of all was Laura herself. Her body bore 18 stab wounds, savage, repetitive injuries that spoke of anger and deep intent. Forensic investigators could immediately theorize that most of the strikes happened post-mortem, done less with murderous purpose and more with a need to exaggerate the brutality of the scene. The perpetrator hadn't just wanted her dead, they wanted this crime to scar and horrify anyone who found her. However, an experienced crime scene technician noticed what the untrained eye might have missed. Faint ligature marks on Laura's upper arms and legs suggested her body hadn't been sprawled across the mattress the entire time. She had almost certainly been moved, carefully repositioned like a macabre chess piece. Odd inconsistencies quickly began to surface. A glass of red wine still sat on Laura's nightstand, untouched. Why would someone enjoying a calm glass of wine suddenly be overpowered by a sadistic killer with zero evidence of struggle to match the scene's apparent chaos? Even the overturned chair in the corner looked as though it had toppled in slow motion. No scratches on the hardwood floor, no splinters where one might have expected such violence to leave a mark. Then, there were the footprints. 2 separate sets of shoe imprints stood out on the plush beige carpet. The first were small and faint, likely belonging to Laura herself, but the other pair was jarringly inconsistent. a pair of boot prints that seemed curiously deliberate, stepping carefully near high-visibility areas like the blood-stained bedspread and the area near the dresser drawers. The boot prints also appeared too clean, as though they had been added after the fact or perhaps left by someone wearing protective coverings. Not something a frenzied intruder desperate for money would think to do. The crime scene's peculiarities continued. A closer look at the bedroom revealed faint marks from gloves smeared across surfaces, further reinforcing the suspicion the perpetrator had gone out of their way to avoid leaving identifiable fingerprints. The suggestion that gloves had been used, paired with the meticulous arrangement of chaos, signaled calculated intent. "It's almost amateurishly professional," an investigator noted aloud. "Like they've seen this in a movie." Forensic teams swabbed and dusted as they worked their way around the room. On the bed, splashes of Laura's blood had landed in patterns inconsistent with the provided narrative. The blood spatter indicated she was likely unconscious during the attack, her body unmoving, offering no resistance to the frenzied assault. For the detectives, this was the first major crack in the charade. If Laura hadn't been conscious, how could this have been the result of a violent struggle like the scene wanted to suggest? They knew immediately that toxicology reports would be key to understanding this mystery. When they turned their attention to the bedside nightstand, a subtle but critical detail emerged. The half-empty bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, among Laura's usual reading materials. Nearby lay an already unwrapped set of sleeping pills, but without a prescription bottle to match. Investigators made a quick note. The presence of drugs combined with the untouched wine suggested sedation before death. Another point in favor of a controlled act rather than an opportunistic attack. By the time the room was fully photographed, dusted and documented, what had initially appeared as a vicious robbery had begun to look more and more like an elaborately staged performance. Someone had wanted this scene to scream chaotic random crime, but every element seemed carefully curated, almost like a grotesque art installation built for an audience. Meanwhile, downstairs, Jonathan Miller continued to meet each officer who crossed his path with a haunting blend of grief and confusion. But for the detectives, a gnawing question hung in the air. Did the devastated man crying on the porch orchestrate the nightmare upstairs? The stark contrast between the well-maintained facade of the Miller residence and the blood-soaked bedroom hidden within could only lead to one conclusion for investigators. This wasn't just murder, it was a message, calculated, manipulative, and chillingly precise. But who was the audience, and what story was the killer attempting to sell? The husband gradually becomes the prime suspect. Jonathan Miller had always been a man of stature, a towering figure both politically and socially in Austin, Texas. He wore his reputation like a finely tailored suit, spotless, polished, and impossible to unravel. As mayor, his charm and dedication earned him public trust and admiration. But on the morning of October 15, 2018, as detectives processed the scene of his wife Laura's brutal murder, Jonathan's carefully constructed image began to crack, piece by piece. Initially, Jonathan's emotional response, a devastated husband unraveling before police on his stately front porch, fit the profile of a grieving spouse. He sobbed openly, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Every word he uttered seemed heavy with disbelief and despair. Who would do this to Laura? Why would anyone want to hurt her? The mere suggestion that he might somehow be involved was almost unthinkable to those familiar with the Golden Boy mayor. And yet, not even the most respected figures are above suspicion when the crime is this personal. As standard procedure, investigators began a deep dive into Jonathan's timeline. They listened carefully, scrutinizing every gesture, every shift in tone in his statements. His account of events was clear-cut but tinged with subtle inconsistencies. "I left at 6:30 this morning," he had told officers. "I was at the office when I got worried since she wasn't picking up her phone. I came home to check on her." This seemed plausible at first glance, but detectives immediately noted the oddity in how he chose to describe Laura's refusal to answer the phone. "I thought she might be sleeping or busy." At just past 8 o'clock in the morning, most people wouldn't assume busy meant something significant. And when pressed about where he had been during the exact moments when the murder likely occurred, Jonathan's answers were detailed, but perhaps a little too detailed. "He's rehearsed this," one investigator murmured to another in a hushed moment of reflection. Then there was the physical evidence, or rather, the peculiar lack of it. Jonathan's clothes were impeccable, with not a single stain or wrinkle indicating the frantic morning he claimed to have endured. Detectives noticed that despite his emotional volatility, his shirt was neatly tucked and spotless. He didn't even appear to have broken a sweat. a jarring juxtaposition to the alleged horror he had discovered only an hour earlier. Meanwhile, inside the Miller estate, forensic experts uncovered Laura's toxicology results. Her blood revealed high levels of a powerful sedative, strong enough to render her unconscious before the attack. If Laura had been drugged before the murder, it meant this wasn't a random act of violence. It was calculated, premeditated. And the pool of potential suspects narrowed dramatically as detectives began to ask, who would have access to Laura and the knowledge to incapacitate her so methodically? "We're not looking for an intruder," one detective said pointedly as they examined the crime scene photos. "There's no sign of forced entry on any door or window. Whoever did this, she let them in, or they were already here." Another detail began to weigh heavily on the investigators: the staged nature of the crime scene. The apparent robbery with expensive jewelry and cash carelessly left behind immediately raised suspicions. A true burglar, even a panicked one, wouldn't have ignored the easy-to-grab valuables in plain sight. And then there were the footprints near the bed, clean, deliberate, and the lack of legitimate struggle suggested Laura had been attacked while deeply sedated. The clincher was the obscure yet crucial discovery found back in Jonathan's office. Detectives retrieved a search warrant and combed through his belongings. In the secured drawer of his desk was evidence that pointed directly back to Laura's poisoning, a prescription bottle for lorazepam, the same sedative found in Laura's blood. Curiously, the prescription was not in Jonathan's name but bore that of a business associate. It was unexpected enough to feel incriminating but plausible enough to serve as a defense later. And this was all before they found records on Jonathan's browsing history showing queries like, "How long does lorazepam stay in your system?" That seemingly innocuous sequence of web searches sent a chill through the prosecution team. By the time they sat Jonathan down for his first interrogation, the tone had shifted dramatically. Gone was the sympathetic approach of comforting the shaken widower. Instead, subtle but leading questions began to create cracks in Jonathan's narrative. "Mr. Miller," one of the lead detectives began, "can you remind us again what time you left your home this morning?" "It was around 6:30, Jonathan said, his voice steady but slightly subdued. "And you mentioned you called Mrs. Miller during your drive to work. Was that unusual for you too?" "Not at all. I call her almost every morning," he replied, slightly faltering. The detective leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "And Laura? She usually answers?" Yes, well, not always." Moments of hesitation like this began to punctuate the rest of his responses. Though outwardly cooperative, Jonathan's confidence seemed to waver under further scrutiny. He often diverted his gaze or shifted in his chair as they asked about mundane details like what Laura had planned for the day, or why he chose to return home so early, based solely on her unanswered calls. His body language wasn't lost on detectives. "He's holding back," another officer muttered quietly as they observed him through the one-way mirror during a break in questioning. In an effort to further untangle his story, investigators questioned Jonathan about his marriage, a topic that made even the polished mayor pause. Though outwardly presenting as Austin's model power couple, recent interviews with friends and neighbors painted a more turbulent picture. Witnesses recalled loud arguments, periods of visible tension, and rumors that Laura had discovered unsettling details about Jonathan's business dealings, including allegations of corruption and extramarital affairs. Attempts to piece together Laura's last weeks painted an ominous picture of a woman deeply dissatisfied, and possibly preparing to take action against her husband. The deeper detectives dug into his personal life, the greater the cracks began to show. Financial records revealed Jonathan had recently liquidated assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the timing curiously aligning with Laura's private inquiries into his wealth. There were even rumors, whispered cautiously among Austin's elite, that Jonathan had kept mistresses, one of whom had been spotted entering his campaign office late into the night on more than one occasion. Outside the marble halls of the Miller mansion, the public narrative was split. Some residents rallied around Jonathan, arguing he was a victim of circumstance further victimized by aggressive law enforcement. Others, however, began to see through the cracks in his grief-stricken facade, recalling his sharp temper and an ego that made Jonathan Miller feel just untouchable enough to gamble everything. By the end of the week, one thing had become clear to detectives: Jonathan Miller's polished exterior was hiding fractures. While they couldn't yet prove he was behind Laura's death, they knew where their investigation needed to be focused, squarely on the grieving, trembling man who had once been Austin's golden boy. Dark secrets begin to surface. As the detectives dug deeper into the seemingly perfect life of Jonathan and Laura Miller, The cracks in their gilded facade grew impossible to ignore. At first glance, they were Austin's golden couple, a respected mayor with an unwavering public image and his elegant, charitable wife who radiated poise at fundraisers and local events. But beneath that veneer of affluence and sophistication lay a web of secrets so dark and tangled that it began to warp every aspect of the investigation. It started with whispers. A neighbor, hesitant but unable to hold back curiosity, pulled a detective aside during a walkthrough of the neighborhood. "They're not as perfect as they look, you know," she said, furtively glancing toward the Miller house as though they could overhear her. "We'd hear them sometimes. Late at night, shouting, doors slamming." Others echoed the same sentiment. While many were reluctant to speak ill of the mayor while his grief dominated headlines, hints of a fractured marriage began to emerge. Friends of Laura, speaking under anonymity, described a woman whose confidence, once so unshakable, had started to erode in recent months. She had confided that her husband had become distant and controlling, traits that mirrored the whispers surrounding his professional career. And then, there was the biggest revelation of all. Laura had been preparing to leave Jonathan. She was scared, though, admitted one of Laura's closest confidants after hours of hesitation, finally relaying the story during a private interview. She said Jonathan wouldn't let her walk away, that he cared too much about appearances. The friend paused, then added in a hushed voice, "She even joked once that she might not survive it." Detectives' interest peaked further when they uncovered Laura's recent activities, which spoke of someone quietly yet determinedly planning for a life without her husband. Over the past month she'd consulted divorce attorneys, transferred small amounts of money into a personal bank account, and even reached out to private investigators. But it wasn't just her marriage she was investigating, it was Jonathan himself. Makings of a larger story began to come together. Laura wasn't just preparing to escape a broken marriage, she was uncovering secrets that the mayor had fought to keep buried. The more she dug into his affairs, the more she seemed to find. Evidence pointed to financial improprieties hidden behind his picture-perfect facade of philanthropy. Charitable donations weren't always reaching their recipients. Public works projects featured suspiciously inflated costs, lining the pockets of shell companies most likely created to funnel money, companies tied back to Jonathan. "She uncovered something big," one investigator said, glancing over the growing case files spread across the conference table. "And she wasn't just going to sit on it." Behind the scenes, Laura had been compiling a paper trail. Gone were the days when she smiled in his campaign ads or sat quietly at his side during press conferences. She'd begun to distance herself subtly, preparing for the day when she could expose her husband without fear of retribution. Those who knew her now admitted that her actions weren't driven just by anger or betrayal, they stemmed from a sense of responsibility. She couldn't watch Jonathan manipulate the people of Austin anymore. A paper trail was one thing, but Laura herself became increasingly jittery in the weeks leading up to her murder. In the days before, a close friend testified to Laura's growing fear. Jonathan wasn't dumb, they recounted, and he had a way of knowing when people were plotting against him. Laura told me she thought he'd picked up on something, a fight they had a few nights before. The friend shook their head. She said it felt final, like he knew. But the story didn't stop there. Rumors of infidelity began to follow Jonathan like a dark shadow. While Laura had been researching the finances, her attorney speculated she had also been looking into his relationships with staffers and interns. One name in particular surfaced repeatedly, a young campaign aide who had been seen entering Jonathan's office late into the evenings. Detailing these encounters didn't lead to direct evidence of an affair, but it painted the picture of a man increasingly reckless in maintaining his double life. The detectives also unearthed cryptic communications between Jonathan and a business associate tied to the shady shell companies. In one email flagged by investigators, Jonathan wrote, "We need to make sure everything stays quiet. One loose thread, and this whole thing unravels." What, detectives wondered, had Jonathan feared would unravel? His career, his empire, or his marriage? The connections became increasingly clear. The man sobbing on his porch had not only been hiding personal imperfections but a web of corruption, greed, and lies that stretched far beyond his family. The more secrets they uncovered, the more the pendulum swung toward motive. Laura Miller had become more than a wife fed up with her husband's ego and deceit. She was now someone with the power to shatter both his career and his freedom. She had him in a corner, a senior detective theorized while reviewing the findings one night. The divorce, the paper trail, the private investigation. She knew everything. And if she went public, this guy wasn't just losing re-election, he was going to prison. Detectives began to piece together a chilling possibility. Jonathan wouldn't just lose everything, his money, his respect, his political career. He would lose the very image of perfection that he had spent decades cultivating. And if there was one thing Jonathan Miller couldn't bear, it was losing control of his image. The secrets that Laura had uncovered turned what initially seemed like a random act of violence into a meticulously planned cover-up. The staged crime scene that had screamed break-in gone wrong now spoke of desperation. Jonathan didn't just want Laura dead, he wanted the story surrounding her murder to shield his own involvement and protect the life he so desperately clung to. As the investigation widened, one thing became clear. Laura's murder was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act of survival. The secrets she had unearthed were weapons, and her husband was a man who had everything to lose if those weapons fell into the wrong hands. The cracks in Jonathan Miller's perfect image had become canyons, and as detectives examined them, they knew they were standing on the precipice of exposing something much bigger than a troubled marriage. The question now wasn't just how far Jonathan had gone to silence his wife, but whether there was anything left of the man Austin had once proudly called their mayor. The double life of Jonathan Miller. For years, Jonathan Miller had been the golden boy of Austin. Handsome, eloquent, and bursting with charisma, he'd been the city's answer to the quintessential American dream. Rising from modest beginnings, he crossed all the hurdles of modern politics, shaking hands with the working class while earning the trust of Austin's elite. His promise of a brighter future for all had been punctuated by dazzling campaign ads featuring his picturesque family. His elegant wife Laura and two adorable young children posed in front of their stately colonial mansion. On the surface, everything about him radiated perfection. But as the investigation into Laura Miller's murder deepened, a far darker portrait of Jonathan began to emerge, a man leading a double life so carefully constructed that it felt more like a role than reality. Jonathan's life had always been carefully compartmentalized. By day he dazzled constituents with promises of infrastructure reform and social justice, making impassioned speeches that had Austin cheering for their forward-thinking mayor. By night, behind the scenes of their family's glossy public image, Jonathan was a man consumed by vanity, greed, and impulses that contradicted his every public stance. The obsession with power. Jonathan's rise to power hadn't been entirely smooth, but it was meticulously planned. Former campaign staffers, when privately interviewed, described a man who lived and breathed control in all aspects of his political career. Jonathan wasn't just determined to win, one staffer disclosed. He had to win. He didn't handle failure well. If you brought him bad news, you could see his temper flare, though he'd mask it in public. Once elected, Jonathan worked hard to foster an image of a selfless servant of the people. But Michael Carver, a former financial consultant for one of his projects, painted a different picture after agreeing to testify in the investigation. Jonathan wasn't driven by a desire to help others, Carver revealed. He was obsessed with building his brand, the Miller legacy. That's all he cared about, leaving behind a legacy that would rival the greats, and he was ruthless about it. Detectives found that Jonathan's hunger for power wasn't confined to politics. Financial records revealed a troubling pattern of corruption. Underneath the shiny exterior of his mayoral achievements were public works projects with suspiciously inflated costs, donations that never reached their charity destinations, and shady business dealings with private contractors. Shell companies linked to Jonathan's closest confidants funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into untraceable accounts, and many of the city's most sought-after neighborhoods were peppered with under-the-table real estate deals benefiting his personal portfolio. "It's like a house of cards," an investigating detective observed grimly. "Once you start pulling out the base, the money trail, everything he built comes crashing down. The charming family man, but only on paper." It wasn't only Austin's public that Jonathan was lying to. Behind the perfectly curated campaign photos of him kissing Laura's cheek or playing ball with his kids, the truth of his family life was unraveling, long before Laura dared to try and escape it. In private, Jonathan was known to be controlling, to the point where Laura's friends whispered about how guarded she had become. One close confidant told police that Laura had stopped attending casual lunches or wine nights with her usual circle, often citing, "Jonathan doesn't like me going out too much." It was as though her world had been shrinking around her, one concession to his ego at a time. He wanted her to be perfect, the friend added. Not just for him but for his career. She was supposed to be the perfect mayor's wife, kind, polished, supportive, but always in the background. But Laura was not content being merely a prop. She began subtly pushing back in small ways that, according to friends, didn't go unnoticed by Jonathan. One of their housekeepers, interviewed by detectives, described the simmering tension that had grown inside the Miller household over the last year. They used to argue, she admitted reluctantly, mostly behind closed doors but sometimes loud enough for us to hear. She hesitated, then added cautiously, "One time Mr. Miller said to her, 'You think you can leave me? Don't forget who built this life for you.' I think that scared her." The women in the shadows. As forensic accountants and private investigators continued peeling back layers of Jonathan's secret world, an entirely separate web of lies began to emerge, this time involving his personal life. While Laura was quietly building up evidence to take to her divorce lawyer, Jonathan was feeding his insatiable need for power in another way, through a series of extramarital affairs. One name stood out in particular: Emily Pearson, a young campaign aide whose rapid rise through Jonathan's political office had not gone unnoticed by his inner circle. While their relationship remained unconfirmed in the early stages of the investigation, texts between Jonathan and Emily recovered from his personal phone raised more than a few eyebrows. "Can't wait to see you tonight," one late-night message from Jonathan read. "Don't forget to come after everyone's left, no one can know," she replied. Emily wasn't the only one. Detectives uncovered evidence that Jonathan had rented apartments under dummy names for years, discreetly located throughout Austin, one of which contained receipts for luxury gifts matching jewelry worn by several women in his orbit. Detectives theorized that Jonathan's relationships weren't only personal dalliances, they were an extension of his obsessive need for validation. It wasn't about love or intimacy, one police psychologist noted. It was about control. If he could captivate people, bend women to his will, then it only fed his delusion that he was untouchable. A double life on the brink of collapse. The further the detectives delved into Jonathan's life, the more it became clear how unsustainable his carefully constructed kingdom truly was. Laura had uncovered enough evidence of financial corruption to destroy his public career. She had begun to confide in people, letting them in on what exactly her husband was hiding, and most threateningly of all, she'd taken steps to dictate her freedom, planning the divorce, lining up allies, and secretly gathering everything she needed to blow his empire wide open. Jonathan, on paper, had everything to lose. His personal greed wasn't just endangering his career, but now his freedom, reputation, and the very stability of his family. Laura was no longer just his wife, she'd become his biggest threat, and in Jonathan's mind, there was no room for threats. She knew too much, an investigator concluded as they pieced together their findings. And if there's one thing people like Jonathan can't stand, it's losing the illusion of control. What detectives were uncovering wasn't just the private failings of a powerful man. It was the twisted reality of someone who could no longer separate the role he played in public from the web of lies he was desperately spinning from the shadows. Jonathan Miller wasn't just a grieving husband, he was a man who had spent years constructing a life of deception, and whose world was finally beginning to collapse in on itself. A murder plot, meticulously planned. The realization that Laura was slipping beyond his control set something chilling in motion within Jonathan Miller. It wasn't immediate. There wasn't a single moment that marked his decision to take her life. Instead, it was a progression. A slow-burning fire of desperation and fury, fueled by the fear of losing everything he had worked so tirelessly to build. Laura was no longer just his wife. She was the threat that could topple it all. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. No, the murder of Laura Miller was something different. It was calculated, methodical, and disturbingly precise. Every step of what Jonathan did next pointed to a man determined to silence her while preserving the illusion that his hands were clean. Phase 1. Identifying the threat. Jonathan had always prided himself on his ability to read people. His gift for persuasion had served him well in politics, but it wasn't just charisma, it was an inherent ability to sense when people were moving against him. In the months leading up to Laura's murder, Jonathan began to notice the subtle ways his wife had changed. She no longer greeted him with the easy smiles that once defined their partnership. There was an edge to her tone, a distance in her once affectionate eyes. He started piecing together the clues, the increased activity on her email accounts, the cryptic phone calls she took behind closed doors, the legal-looking paperwork she carefully tucked into her handbag before leaving the house. Through sheer paranoia, Jonathan discovered what Laura had been doing. She was planning to leave him, and she wasn't going to do it quietly. And worse, she had uncovered his secrets. Jonathan soon realized that Laura wasn't just seeking freedom from their fractured marriage. She had gathered enough evidence of his corruption to end his career and, potentially, send him to prison. In hushed conversations with his closest confidants, whispered fears turned into dire realizations. If Laura went public with what she knew, it wouldn't just be the end of the Jonathan Miller people worshipped. It would be the end of him entirely. "She can't ruin me. I won't let her ruin me," Jonathan whispered to himself one sleepless night, walking through the darkened halls of their sprawling home, every step creaking under the weight of his escalating thoughts. Phase 2. The tools of the plan. Jonathan's mind worked like clockwork, calculating, analyzing, and ultimately crafting the plan. He knew that if this were to work, it had to look like something it wasn't. A random act of violence, a home invasion gone horribly wrong. Something that would pull the suspicion as far away from him as possible. But first, he needed the tools. A few weeks before the murder, Jonathan took advantage of his influence and connections. A discreet inquiry through a trusted acquaintance connected him to a solution: lorazepam, a sedative strong enough to knock someone unconscious. The pills didn't come from a pharmacy under his name. That would have been reckless. Instead, they came through a friend he had persuaded with harmless lies. "It's for a family friend," he had told them. "She's struggling with anxiety and doesn't have insurance." Jonathan didn't stop there. The second component of his grim plan was a knife. A perfectly sharpened chef's knife he kept hidden in the study. The blade was unusual in its distinctiveness, given to him years earlier by a fellow politician during a celebratory dinner. Engraved on the metal was an inscription, a reminder of his rise to prominence, but it had now become the tool of something far more sinister. Jonathan selected it for its precision, trusting he could handle it without leaving a mess he couldn't clean. Lastly, he began planting the seeds for the staged crime scene. Over the course of days, Jonathan made mental notes of how to create chaos in their impeccably curated home, without leaving signs of hesitation or intent. He researched details late at night on his phone, typing phrases into his browser: how to conceal footprints, robbery crime scene tips, and how to clean blood evidence. He deleted every search immediately, but some of the answers stuck with him. Gloves, a controlled method, just enough disarray to confuse the narrative. Jonathan understood that the timing had to be flawless. It couldn't be too spontaneous or rushed. It had to take place when suspicion was least likely to fall on him. Phase 3. The night of the murder. The evening of the murder began as so many others did, with dinner on the patio overlooking their sprawling backyard. Jonathan had made an effort to appear relaxed, casual even, pouring Laura a generous glass of Cabernet Sauvignon and engaging her with light-hearted talk about their children. If Laura sensed anything unusual, she didn't show it. In fact, Jonathan had spent so long perfecting his facade that even the smallest cracks never showed. As the night unwound, Jonathan slipped away momentarily and crushed the lorazepam tablets into a fine powder. He knew Laura trusted him enough not to question the wine he handed her minutes later. Setting it before her with the same effortless charm that had won him a city's admiration, he smiled and raised his own glass in an empty toast. "You deserve a break," he said, leaning slightly forward, watching her take a sip. She didn't drink much, but it didn't take long. By the time their short conversation dwindled into a comfortable silence, Laura's head began to sag, her body responding to the drug coursing through her veins. Jonathan watched her intently as her movements slowed, her words growing faint until she finally leaned back, unconscious. Jonathan waited. He calculated every minute, ensuring the sedative had fully taken effect before carrying her upstairs to their bedroom. His every step was deliberate, measured, as he positioned her on the bed just so. He retrieved the knife from its hidden spot in his study and returned to the room, staring down at her motionless form, faint breaths the only sign of life she had left. And then he began. Phase 4. Crafting the illusion. If there was anything that Jonathan prided himself on, it was control. Control over people, situations, and outcomes. Even now, standing in the middle of the act that would irrevocably change his life, he moved with chilling precision. The first stab was methodical, not rushed. He struck her as though following a script, ensuring too much blood wouldn't spill in ways he hadn't accounted for. The subsequent wounds, however, were different. They needed to paint a picture of rage, unpredictability. Jonathan switched his grip on the knife, ensuring his angle was inconsistent. The depths varied, each strike concealing the calculated intent behind it. Then, the room, the aftermath. Jonathan ransacked the drawers of their dressers, tossing jewelry to the ground, scattering cash in areas he knew detectives would later scrutinize. He overturned a chair near the bedside, enough to suggest a struggle without breaking anything that couldn't be precisely restored. The knife, still slick with blood, was wiped down carefully and tucked away in a hidden location he planned to retrieve later. Finally, Jonathan meticulously retraced his steps, ensuring he left no unintentional footprints or marks. Pulling on gloves, he wiped surfaces clean of any potential traces, his pulse steady even as the reality of what he had done hovered over him. For Jonathan, Laura was gone, but her silence ensured his survival. The perfect plan, or so it seemed. Jonathan believed his plan was airtight. His alibi would have him at the office at the time of the murder. The scene would confuse investigators, leading them toward a frustrated burglar rather than a calculated killer. And above all, he would stand as the grieving widower, a man shocked and shattered by the unspeakable loss of his wife. But as the investigators began to comb through the wreckage of Jonathan Miller's life, they found cracks in his perfection. And slowly, piece by piece, the house of cards he had so painstakingly built began to collapse, revealing the evidence of guilt. From the very beginning of their investigation into Laura Miller's brutal murder, detectives knew that uncovering the truth wouldn't come from a single, glaring piece of evidence. This wasn't a case of an impulsive killer leaving behind sloppy clues or an incriminating fingerprint pointing directly to the crime. No, Jonathan Miller's charade had been carefully constructed, but as with any web of lies, cracks began to appear, a series of almost invisible breadcrumbs that ultimately unraveled the facade of innocence the mayor so desperately clung to. The knife that vanished. The murder weapon, a knife used to stab Laura 18 times, was at the center of the forensic investigation. The level of brutality inflicted on the victim was horrifying, but experienced detectives quickly noted something strange. The wounds weren't haphazard, they were precise, deliberate, and calculated to look like a frenzied attack. It was clear that whoever held the knife didn't lose control, they were in full control. When investigators learned that a knife from Jonathan Miller's prized personal collection was missing, their eyebrows immediately rose. The blade wasn't just any random tool, it was distinctive, a high-end chef's knife gifted to Jonathan years earlier, engraved with a congratulatory message celebrating his meteoric rise in local politics. The mayor had even shown off the knife before, using it during a cooking demonstration at a charity event. People remembered it. But now, it was gone. A discreet search of the Miller estate failed to turn up the blade, and Jonathan seemed conspicuously indifferent about its absence. "What happened to that special chef's knife of yours?" a detective casually asked during one of Jonathan's interviews, gauging his reaction. Jonathan flinched slightly before brushing it off. I'm not sure. We must have misplaced it. You know, it's just a knife. I haven't seen it recently." It wasn't just a knife, and detectives knew it. Forensics teams were certain if they found the blade, it would carry the telltale imprint of Laura's wounds and possibly DNA evidence. But its disappearance spoke volumes. Jonathan Miller, a meticulous man obsessed with control, had something to hide. The footprints that didn't belong. When forensic teams entered the Miller bedroom, they made a haunting discovery. 2 distinct sets of shoe prints. The first, faint and barefoot, were consistent with Laura's movements before the attack. The second set was peculiar, a series of deliberate patterned impressions made by shoes that seemed too clean, considering the bloody carnage at the scene. Detectives initially theorized that an intruder in boots had committed the crime. That detail would have fit the home invasion story the murder scene tried so hard to sell. However, the shoe imprints told a different tale. Forensic analysts noted that the intruder's footprints appeared selectively placed, almost as if someone was carefully walking around the room, avoiding the bloodstains in odd, strategic ways. Even more curious, plaster molds from the prints revealed the boots had a sole pattern consistent with Jonathan's favorite pair of designer Chelsea boots. A check of his closet confirmed that the boots were missing, just like the knife. Further investigation revealed another damning piece of evidence. A faint print on the bedroom's hardwood floor, leading toward the study, bore traces of blood too diluted to be visible to the naked eye. When technicians enhanced the sample using luminescent forensics, it matched perfectly to the pattern on Jonathan's boots. The glass of wine and sleeping pills. One of the most telling details was the wine glass resting on Laura's nightstand. The scene was supposed to resemble a chaotic struggle, yet the glass sat undisturbed, half empty and pristine, its contents untouched by the violence surrounding it. The detectives already suspected Laura had been drugged prior to the stabbing, as blood work from her autopsy revealed significant traces of lorazepam, a powerful sedative. The wine became the primary suspect, a vessel that likely carried the crushing powder Jonathan had so painstakingly prepared. A deeper search into the Miller household revealed the smoking gun, a prescription bottle for lorazepam they ultimately traced back to one of Jonathan's business associates. The name on the label wasn't Laura Miller's, nor anyone connected to her. It was a name tied directly to one of Jonathan's closest allies, someone whom he had manipulated into acquiring the drug. The wine wasn't just a drink, one detective remarked grimly. It was his opening move. He made sure she wouldn't fight back. The browser history that wasn't so clean. Jonathan believed himself to be careful when plotting Laura's murder, but even meticulous men make mistakes when their egos cloud their judgment. Investigators obtained a warrant for Jonathan's electronics, combing through his laptop and phone with forensic precision. Although Jonathan had deleted much of his browser history, tech experts uncovered several damning searches buried in the recovered cache. The search terms read like fragments from a murderer's handbook. How long does lorazepam stay in the bloodstream? Steps for making a crime look like a robbery. Staging a burglary gone wrong tips. Does wine mask sedative effects? Each search raised the investigators' eyebrows higher than the last. Jonathan's attempt to erase the trail of these searches was a clear indication of premeditation. This wasn't just spur-of-the-moment violence, as he would later try to claim during interrogations. It was a meticulously planned and cowardly orchestration. The gloves that told two stories. Detectives were struck by another small but significant detail. There were no fingerprints anywhere on Laura's body or in much of the bedroom. Despite the apparent chaos, the jewelry tossed on the floor, the rummaged dressers, everything had been wiped clean of identifiable prints. Whoever did this used gloves, forensic experts concluded. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered incriminating surveillance footage from a local hardware store taken just days before the murder. Jonathan could be seen browsing the tool section, eventually purchasing a pair of black leather gloves. On the receipt, which he had carelessly left in his vehicle, was an additional purchase: heavy-duty trash bags. The cracks in the alibi. Jonathan's alibi, while initially convincing, began to unravel under the weight of forensic timelines and digital evidence. His claim that he had been working at his office all morning began to show cracks when security footage from his building revealed a gap in his timeline. While he insisted he had arrived at exactly 6:30 a.m., the security log showed no activity on his keycard until nearly 30 minutes later. Where had he been during that unaccounted time? Investigators theorized he had been staging the scene before returning to his office, ensuring he was present there just long enough to give himself an alibi. The perfect crime that never was. No single piece of evidence would have condemned Jonathan Miller on its own, but layer by layer the curtain was lifted, revealing a man who had plotted every detail of his wife's death, only for his arrogance to betray him. The knife, the wine, the boots, the missing gloves, all of it brought detectives closer to the truth. When presented with the mountain of evidence against him, Jonathan's smug, calm demeanor began to falter. For a man who built his career on maintaining control, being outmaneuvered by investigators proved to be his ultimate undoing. This wasn't just a murder, one prosecutor would later argue, it was a performance. And like all bad performances, it left behind too many loose ends. The facade crumbles. Under legal pressure, Jonathan Miller had always thrived under scrutiny. It was the hallmark of his political career. His ability to handle tough questions with ease, to turn hard situations into opportunities that worked in his favor. But the pressure he faced in the weeks following his wife Laura's murder was unlike anything he had ever encountered. What had started as hushed whispers of sympathy for a grieving widower soon grew into pointed accusations. Investigators weren't just circling around Jonathan, they were closing in, and nothing, his charm, his connections, his meticulously curated public image, could save him from what was coming. It didn't happen all at once. It was more like watching cracks slowly spread across a glass window. At first, Jonathan maintained his composure, leveraging every ounce of his charisma to keep the narrative under control. But as the weeks passed and the evidence against him mounted, his carefully constructed facade began to collapse under the relentless weight of legal pressure. The interrogations, a shaky defense. Jonathan's initial interviews with detectives painted the picture of a man deeply distraught, a husband blindsided by unimaginable tragedy. He cried openly, wrung his hands and, in a voice heavy with emotion, repeatedly asked the same question. Who could do this to her? For a while it worked. Detectives initially handled him with care, speaking to him as a grieving spouse rather than a suspect. But even in those early sessions, Jonathan's responses weren't as airtight as he believed them to be. "When was the last time you saw Laura?" they asked him. "This morning, before I left for work," Jonathan replied, his voice trembling. The detectives nodded, but their notes showed skepticism. By then, they already had evidence suggesting Laura had been drugged the previous night, long before Jonathan claimed to have left the house. "What time did you get to your office?" another detective pressed in a later interrogation. 6:30, like I said," Jonathan insisted. "I was there the whole morning." But the security logs at the office said otherwise, showing a half-hour gap when Jonathan couldn't prove his whereabouts. It was a small inconsistency, but paired with mounting forensic evidence, it became another crack in his story. As the interrogations continued, Jonathan's polished demeanor started to fray at the edges. He grew irritable, defensive. When detectives confronted him with discrepancies, like the missing knife or the suspicious Google searches recovered from his laptop, his answers became evasive. "Why would I search for something like that?" he snapped, when asked about a query on making a crime scene look like a robbery. "Do you know how many people have access to my computer?" Though he attempted to redirect suspicion, the detectives weren't buying it. "He's panicking," one of them noted after a particularly tense session. "He thinks if he talks his way out of this we'll stop looking. But we're not stopping." The moment of no return. The court of public opinion. If Jonathan's unraveling began behind closed doors in interrogation rooms, it became glaringly public the moment leaks about the investigation hit the news. For weeks, the media had largely portrayed Jonathan as a grieving husband, framing the murder as a heartbreaking tragedy that rocked one of Austin's most beloved families. But as details began to surface, about the staged crime scene, the missing knife, and the suspicious prescription tied to lorazepam, the tone of the coverage started to shift. Suddenly, local and national outlets were no longer asking, "Who killed Laura Miller?" but, "Did the mayor kill his wife?" News vans swarmed the Miller estate, reporters camping outside in hopes of capturing Jonathan's face as he left for meetings or returned from consultations with his legal team. Pundits speculated on evening broadcasts, analyzing his every word and movement. The once adoring public began to turn on him, their sympathy replaced by skepticism, and, in some cases, outright hostility. "You think you know someone," one longtime Austin resident told a reporter, shaking her head. "We all thought the world of Jonathan, but now, I don't know, I don't even know if I can look at his picture again." The pressure from the media and the public wasn't just external, it seeped into every aspect of Jonathan's life. Friends he had known for years suddenly stopped returning his calls. Endorsements he relied on for his re-election campaign were quietly retracted. Even his closest political allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who, guilty or not, had become a lightning rod for controversy. The legal strategy unravels. Jonathan's legal team did their best to protect their client, but even they couldn't deny that the odds were stacked against him. Initially, their proposed strategy revolved around casting doubt on the evidence, suggesting, for example, that the crime scene could have been staged by an intruder, and that the drugging of Laura might have been unrelated to the murder. But the prosecution's case was airtight, built on a mountain of forensic evidence, digital records, and behavioral inconsistencies. They described in excruciating detail Jonathan's planning, the crushed lorazepam in the wine, the staged burglary, the calculated cleanup of the scene. They painted him not as a panicked husband, but as a cold, calculating man who had exterminated a threat, not out of impulse but out of desperation. The prosecutors didn't even need to take apart his alibi to damage his credibility. The traces of blood on his Chelsea boots, the deleted Google searches about staging crime scenes, and the receipts for gloves and trash bags all spoke volumes about Jonathan's meticulous preparation. Everything he did was about control, the prosecution argued in court. Jonathan Miller cared about one thing, his image. When Laura threatened to shatter that, he didn't act out of grief or anger or passion. He acted with precision. He planned her death just like he planned his career, with an iron grip on every detail. The breaking point. The confession without confessing. The most dramatic moment of the investigation came during what many called Jonathan's partial confession. It wasn't an admission of guilt in the traditional sense. Jonathan was too proud, too convinced of his own intellect to outright admit to the crime, but during a particularly brutal interrogation session, under immense pressure, his mask finally slipped. "A part of me wanted to let her go," Jonathan murmured, staring blankly at the table in front of him. "But she was going to destroy everything I built, every single thing." The detectives exchanged glances, knowing they had just heard the closest thing to a confession they were likely to get. "What are you saying, Jonathan?" one of them prodded carefully. "That she deserved to die?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, his gaze steeled. "I'm saying she left me no choice," he replied coldly. In that moment the room felt heavy with his contradiction, an unrepentant man who had revealed just enough of his inner thoughts to implicate himself while still feigning innocence. The collapse. By the time Jonathan Miller was formally charged with first-degree murder, his life was in shambles. His political career, once heralded as a shining example of modern leadership, was over. His closest friends and colleagues had abandoned him. Most devastatingly, he had lost the trust of the public he had built his life around winning over. As he sat in the defendant's chair during his trial, Jonathan bore little resemblance to the confident, magnetic man Austin had once adored. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, his face aged by months of sleepless nights and stress. He no longer bothered to smile as cameras flashed, nor did he try to charm the jury with well-practiced expressions of grief. After weeks of mounting evidence and relentless questioning, he was a man cornered, and for the first time in his life, Jonathan Miller couldn't control the outcome. The verdict, and a bitter ending. By the summer of 2020, the trial of Jonathan Miller had become one of the most highly publicized legal battles in modern Texas history. The polished, magnetic mayor who once graced the covers of political magazines was now slumped in a defendant's chair, the weight of damning evidence pressing down on his shoulders. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a reckoning of sorts, for a man whose double life and darker impulses had brought everything crashing down. For weeks, prosecutors and defense lawyers sparred in the courtroom, painting dramatically opposing portraits of Jonathan Miller. On one side, he was described as the devoted husband who had tragically lost his wife in an unspeakable crime. On the other, he was depicted as a cold, calculating man who, in his desperation to protect his carefully constructed life, took the ultimate step to silence his own wife. A trial that gripped a nation. People across the country were captivated by the proceedings. Cable news anchors dissected every piece of evidence presented in the courtroom. Legal analysts debated whether Jonathan's methods pointed to genius or desperation. The public hung on every word of Jonathan's defense, but it was the prosecution's narrative that truly shook the nation. Prosecutors left no stone unturned. They recreated the timeline of Laura's murder in chilling detail, walking the jury and spectators through the events leading up to that fateful night. They showed the wine glass laced with lorazepam, the stolen knife missing from Jonathan's prized collection, the web searches that exposed his meticulous planning, and the staged crime scene designed to look like a random burglary gone wrong. They didn't just present evidence, they crafted a story that left no doubt about Jonathan Miller's guilt. "He isn't just a killer," the lead prosecutor thundered during closing arguments. "He is a man so obsessed with his image, so consumed by control, that he didn't hesitate to destroy the person he vowed to love and protect, all to protect a lie." On the other side, Jonathan's high-powered defense team scrambled to keep the jury from being swept away by the prosecution's momentum. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the timeline was flawed, and that there was no direct proof connecting Jonathan to the act of murder. They leaned heavily into the argument that Jonathan was being persecuted out of bias, a vengeance-fueled witch hunt, they called it, to bring down a high-profile figure. Jonathan himself, taking the stand for the first time in the trial's third week, tried to summon the charm that had served him so well in his political career. He told a tearful story of his wife's warmth, her beauty, and his own devastation at losing her so suddenly. He called her the love of my life, and swore on everything he held sacred that he had nothing to do with her death. But for all his eloquence, there were cracks. Prosecutors seized every opportunity to confront him with inconsistencies, from the surveillance footage that placed him outside his office that morning, to his frantic 911 call that now sounded rehearsed under scrutiny. His answers often came across as rehearsed or dodgy, far from the raw, honest emotion the jury wanted to hear from a grieving husband. When asked directly, Why was your prescription for lorazepam found hidden in your office desk, matching the drug in Laura's system? Jonathan froze for just a moment too long. His lawyer quickly objected, but the damage was done. The jury's deliberation. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and arguments, the jury was handed the case. They deliberated for just under 3 days, a long and tense stretch that had both the defense and prosecution on edge. Legal analysts across media platforms speculated endlessly. Would the jury buy into the narrative of a grieving husband, or had the mountain of evidence sealed Jonathan's fate? By the morning of July 21st, the nation held its breath as the jury filed back into the courtroom. The room was silent, tension crackling through the air like static. Jonathan sat stoically, his hands clasped tightly together, though the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed his nerves. "Your Honor," the lead juror began, her voice steady but firm, "we the jury find the defendant, Jonathan Miller, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Reporters were already racing out the doors to broadcast the news, while Jonathan's head fell into his hands. The verdict wasn't unexpected in the eyes of legal commentators, but the finality of it still hit like a hammer. For Jonathan, the master of public perception, it was a defeat as monumental as it was humiliating. The sentencing. Several weeks later, Jonathan returned to court for sentencing. The prosecution, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and his deliberate attempts to manipulate the justice system, pushed for the harshest punishment Texas law could offer, the death penalty. They argued that Jonathan's actions weren't merely a lapse in judgment or a crime of passion. They were the cold, methodical calculations of a man who believed he was above consequences. The defense begged for mercy, calling for life imprisonment without parole. They argued that Jonathan, while flawed, had contributed years of service to his community and deserved the chance to live out his life in reflection. When the judge finally read the sentence, death by lethal injection, the courtroom erupted again in muted shifts of tension. Jonathan, who had remained rigid throughout the proceedings, showed little reaction. If anything, the weight of the verdict seemed to finally break something in him. His head dipped slightly, his expression hollow, as if the reality of his actions had finally sunk in. A legacy destroyed, the fallout was catastrophic, not just for Jonathan, but for the city of Austin itself. Local officials scrambled to distance themselves from his tenure, quietly reworking policies and projects associated with his name. His closest allies, once ardent defenders, feigned ignorance of his darker side. Political pundits labeled him a cautionary tale of ambition gone wild, using him as a textbook example of unchecked power corrupting absolutely. For Laura's family, the verdict brought a hollow kind of closure. "We never wanted this," her sister said tearfully during a press conference after the sentencing. "But we needed justice for Laura. She deserved more than to be turned into a pawn in his game." Jonathan's children, too young to understand the full complexity of their father's crimes, were sent to live with relatives. They would grow up knowing their father as the man who once commanded a city, and later, as the man who destroyed everything he touched. For those who had once idolized Jonathan, his fall from grace was nothing short of Shakespearean. He had it all: power, wealth, a beautiful family, and it wasn't enough. His need to maintain the illusion of perfection led him to the ultimate betrayal, and in doing so, he had destroyed not only his wife, but himself. The bitter end. Jonathan now spends his days on death row, a far cry from the halls of power he once roamed. In the interviews he occasionally grants, he swings between defiance and regret, claiming at times to have been framed and at others, expressing a vague remorse that never quite feels sincere. But no amount of interviews or claims of innocence could undo what had been done. The man who had built an empire of influence found himself reduced to a lonely figure in an orange jumpsuit, waiting for the day his sentence would be carried out. And as history has shown time and again, for those who build their lives on lies, there's only one inevitable outcome. The truth will always rise to the surface. Lessons on ambition and justice. The tragic story of Jonathan and Laura Miller serves as a profound study of the human condition, a tale as old as time about ambition, greed, and the ultimate pursuit of power. But at its heart, it is also a lesson on the unyielding force of justice, no matter how carefully someone hides their sins. Jonathan Miller began his journey as a symbol of hope, a man who stood for progress and possibility in a thriving American city. But beneath the polished surface, his story unraveled into one of unchecked ambition, spiraling into destruction. It leaves behind questions we all grapple with. How far is too far in the chase for success? At what point does control become corruption? And most importantly, what does it say about us when we turn a blind eye to the warning signs, believing in someone's illusion of perfection? The cost of ambition without limits. Ambition, when balanced with integrity, can lead to extraordinary progress. But when ambition tilts into obsession, it becomes dangerous. For Jonathan Miller, ambition wasn't just a quality, it was his defining trait. It powered his meteoric rise in politics, gave him the charisma to become a beloved leader, and allowed him to mask his growing flaws with an image of near perfection. However, ambition without boundaries doesn't just consume the ambitious, it consumes everyone around them. Jonathan wasn't content with building a legacy. He needed his legacy to be flawless, untouchable. He needed the world to see him not as a man, but as an institution. And when anything, whether it was a political scandal, a financial misstep, or even his wife's quiet dissent, threatened to unravel that image, Jonathan was willing to cross lines that no person should ever cross. Laura Miller wasn't just a wife to Jonathan. In his mind, she had become a liability, a ticking time bomb holding the potential to destroy the empire he'd built piece by piece. His decision to end her life wasn't born out of love, anger, or jealousy. It was born out of fear, the fear of losing power, and his belief that his control over his life and his reputation was more important than her humanity. It's a cautionary tale for our society, which often celebrates ambition so fervently that we overlook the warning signs of corruption it may bring. How often do we excuse moral failings in the name of success? How many Jonathans exist in positions of power, wearing masks of integrity while hiding darker truths? Justice as a relentless force. The story of Jonathan Miller also demonstrates the unyielding nature of justice. Crimes may be concealed for a time, lies may flourish in the shadows, but justice has a way of peeling back every layer until the truth is laid bare. Jonathan believed his intellect, his charm, and his meticulous planning made him untouchable, and for a time, it seemed like he might be right. He staged the crime scene to perfection, silenced any witnesses, and positioned himself as the grieving husband, a man consumed by shock and despair. But what he underestimated was the persistent nature of those seeking the truth. Each tiny clue, from the faint boot prints on the hardwood floor to the crushed lorazepam in Laura's wineglass, became part of a broader tapestry of guilt. The detectives pieced together his carefully constructed lies until they collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. If Jonathan's story proves anything, it's that there are no perfect crimes. Each action leaves a trace, and every trace builds toward a picture the guilty cannot erase. Justice, though often delayed, has a way of catching up to even the most clever of criminals. Betrayal in the name of love. Perhaps the most heartbreaking element of this story is the betrayal that lies at its core. At one time, Laura and Jonathan Miller were genuinely in love. They shared a family, dreams, and a life that seemed enviable on the outside. Laura supported Jonathan's ambitions, stood by him during grueling political campaigns, and played the role of the perfect spouse to complement his public persona. But what happens when love becomes conditional, when it hinges on control, appearances, and power? As Jonathan placed more importance on his image than his relationship, their marriage became less about partnership and more about domination. When Laura discovered the skeletons in Jonathan's closet, their bond was severed entirely. To him, she was no longer a partner, she was an obstacle. Jonathan's decision to end Laura's life wasn't just about preserving his legacy. It was also the ultimate betrayal, taking the life of the person who had once trusted him most, all to preserve his illusion of perfection. The ripple effects of greed and pride. Jonathan's actions didn't only destroy Laura, they sent shockwaves through countless lives: his children, who lost both parents, Austin's citizens, whose trust in leadership was shattered, and even his closest allies, whose reputations were forever tarnished by association. Greed and pride, two of humanity's most corrosive traits, are never self-contained. They infect every relationship, every partnership, and every institution they touch. Jonathan's story reminds us that no one operates in isolation. The choices we make, both good and bad, ripple outward in ways we can't always see. For his children, Jonathan's fall from grace leaves a lasting scar. They will grow up knowing that their father, a man they once admired, betrayed everything he claimed to stand for. For Laura's family, the pain of her loss is compounded by the knowledge that it was someone she trusted who had taken her life. And for the people of Austin, the scandal undermined faith in local government, serving as a painful reminder of how power can corrupt even the most trusted figures. The duality of power. The story of Jonathan Miller also reveals the inherent duality of power. Power is neither inherently good nor bad. It is a tool that amplifies the character of the person who holds it. In the right hands, power can create meaningful change, inspire communities, and improve lives. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon for control, manipulation, and destruction. Jonathan's rise to power was driven by his ability to connect with people, to inspire them with a vision of a better future. But as his power grew, so did his inability to distinguish between his public persona and his private self. He became consumed by the image of Jonathan Miller, the mayor, until even those closest to him, Laura, his friends, his confidants, were seen as props or threats, rather than people. A warning and a lesson. In the end, the story of Jonathan and Laura Miller is a warning. It's a warning to those who chase power without restraint, fueled by greed and pride. It's a warning to society which so often elevates ambitious leaders without questioning what lies beneath their shiny exteriors. But it's also a lesson. It teaches us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. It teaches us that justice, though it may take time, cannot be silenced indefinitely. And it teaches us the importance of balance, of ambition tempered with humility, of power balanced with accountability, and of success pursued without sacrificing our core humanity. Laura Miller didn't deserve the fate she suffered. Her story is one of betrayal, loss, and unimaginable pain. But it is also one of justice, a reminder that even in the face of the darkest acts, the light of truth will ultimately prevail. Final message: no such thing as a perfect crime. The story of Jonathan Miller isn't just one of personal tragedy or betrayal. It's a stark reminder that there is no such thing as a perfect crime. It doesn't matter how meticulously someone plans, how clever they think they are, or how deeply they bury their secrets. The truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how carefully it was hidden. Jonathan prided himself on his intellect and ability to control others. His entire life was a balancing act between power and perception, and he genuinely believed he could orchestrate anything, even the brutal murder of his own wife, and walk away without consequence. But the cracks in his plan, the faintest of mistakes, became glowing signposts for those seeking the truth. Criminals, even the most calculating ones, overlook one simple reality: humans are imperfect. And in that imperfection, in the poorly timed searches on a browser, the missing knife, the faint boot prints tracked across a floor, lies the unraveling of even the most carefully plotted schemes, the illusion of control. Jonathan Miller was nothing if not a man obsessed with control. Control over his image, over his career, over his family, and ultimately, over the narrative of what happened to Laura. That obsession became his undoing. In his mind, every move he made was flawless. He drugged Laura to render her unconscious, ensuring there would be no struggle. He staged the room to look like a botched robbery, scattering objects strategically in a display of chaos that felt more forced than authentic. He left just enough of a story behind to shift suspicion toward a nameless, faceless intruder, and yet for all his precision, he miscalculated one critical thing: people's ability to see through the lies, a smudge of blood on the floor, a missing piece of family cutlery, and the cold logic of a staged crime scene all screamed of someone with too much to lose and too much to hide. When combined, these small cracks in Jonathan's performance revealed the larger truth, that the perfect crime he thought he had scripted was just that, a script. And like all poorly executed performances, it fell apart under scrutiny. The failures of a brilliant mind. What makes Jonathan's story particularly striking is how much faith he placed in his own brilliance. He wasn't just arrogant. He was convinced he was smarter than everyone else in the room. This wasn't just a murder to Jonathan, it was a game. A chessboard where he believed every piece was moving at his command. But in his arrogance, he ignored the possibility that others might be able to think 2 steps ahead as well. Detectives didn't need Jonathan to confess outright. They didn't need him to slip up dramatically or leave behind some glaring piece of evidence. What they needed, what they found, were the subtle flaws Jonathan hadn't accounted for. The prescription for lorazepam he thought he had tucked away out of sight, it led a trail back to him. The searches he angrily dismissed as accidents, they painted a picture of a man researching how to cover up his own sins. His alibi, the one he rehearsed so carefully, it fragmented under the weight of hard timelines and missing minutes. What Jonathan failed to understand is that even small inconsistencies, when added together, create a damning narrative. His belief in his own superiority blinded him to his own humanity, and to the errors that inevitably come with it. The power of persistence. The Miller case is also a testament to the power of persistence. Solving a murder like Laura's wasn't quick, nor was it easy. It required patience, careful examination of evidence, and a refusal to be misled by Jonathan's facade. For the detectives and prosecutors working on the case, their focus wasn't on the persona Jonathan had crafted for the public or the tears he shed during his interviews. It was on the evidence, and the story that evidence told. Slowly but surely, piece by piece, they built a case too strong for Jonathan's lies to hold against. Every detail mattered: the faint wine residue that carried traces of lorazepam, the missing knife from Jonathan's prized collection, the methodical placement of objects in the bedroom that looked more like choreography than genuine chaos. Each clue, no matter how small, became part of a larger picture. Justice may sometimes feel delayed, but it is rarely denied, and this case was proof of that. The persistence of those seeking the truth ensured that there was no place for Jonathan to hide, not behind his reputation, not behind his wealth, and certainly not behind his lies. Lessons in hubris and humanity. If there's one overarching truth in the story of Jonathan Miller, it's this: hubris is always fatal. Jonathan's story is the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when someone allows pride and ego to guide their actions. He underestimated everyone around him: his wife, his colleagues, his community, and the legal system. Laura's intelligence, her ability to see through him and take steps to protect herself, became something he couldn't accept. Rather than face the exposure of his flaws, he lashed out in the most cowardly way possible. Similarly, he overestimated his ability to deceive. He believed his reputation, his articulate nature, and his curated image would shield him from blame. He failed to recognize the very real and raw determination of those seeking justice for Laura. In his quest for perfection, for the perfect life, the perfect career, the perfect appearance, Jonathan revealed the reality of human imperfection. He wasn't perfect, and neither was his crime. Justice always finds a way. At the heart of this story is a profound lesson about justice. No matter how careful the criminal, no matter how airtight they believe their plan to be, justice has a way of finding the truth. A single missed detail can be the key to unraveling monumental lies. Jonathan's story isn't just a warning for those who think themselves untouchable, it's a tribute to the resilience of truth. Justice in Laura's case came not all at once, but through relentless effort and attention to detail. It came through the persistence of investigators, the determination of prosecutors, and the courage of those who wouldn't let Laura's voice be silenced. The human reality. Ultimately, the fall of Jonathan Miller is a reminder that no one is above consequence. His arrogance convinced him otherwise, but in the end, his misdeeds collided with the inescapable truth. There's no such thing as a perfect crime. For every action, there is a reaction. For every lie, there is a truth waiting to surface. And in the world of justice, perfection doesn't exist. But persistence does. Dedication does. And when combined, those forces ensure that even the most cunning schemes will fail,